I'm Drew Stevenson, and this is a lecture about statutory interpretation and sentence diagrams. From a sort of textualist standpoint, this is maybe the purest form of textualism. Sentence diagrams are a rigorous form of analyzing a piece of text like a single sentence and figuring out how each word in that sentence relates to every other word, what function each word or clause or phrase has. And this video is for my statutory interpretation and regulation class. Now, for my students, some of you learned sentence diagramming in school growing up and others didn't. This was very popular in the mid 20th century. So people in my generation had learned this. Some of us had to learn it a lot and others only a little. I'm finding that a lot of my students nowadays, very few of them have really studied sentence diagramming before. The types of diagrams that are the most popular in the standard convention for teaching English grammar are technically called Reed-Kellogg diagrams. That's what we're going to be looking at here. You don't have to remember that, but that's named after the linguists in the late 1800s that developed this sort of convention for illustrating the parts of speech of each word in a sentence. Also, please keep in mind that linguists, modern people who study linguistics, have different conventions for diagramming sentences and parts of speech and so forth that look very different and so forth, because what they're doing is analyzing language and trying to detect subtle semantic differences and so forth, as opposed to trying to teach grammar and parts of speech. So this is really was developed as a teaching tool, but also can be a very useful skill for lawyers in analyzing statutes or improving your own legal writing. So let's proceed. By the way, I'm going to start with a quick example that we're going to come back to later. This is what a sentence diagram sort of looks like, although I think I could improve on this one. But this is from Justice Gorsuch when he was a judge on the 10th Circuit in 2015. He put this diagram right in one of his opinions to show how he was interpreting the statute and which clauses modified which words in the statute. This had a lot of implications. The whole case really turned on a very subtle question of statutory interpretation, but the impact for the defendant in the case was a difference of maybe a 5-year prison sentence versus 25 to life. And the clause, where we assigned that clause that you see at the bottom of the diagram and what word it modifies or words in the statute it modifies has an impact on what the courts should expect of prosecutors. Like, what do they actually have to prove and put on a case about, which in turn affects the outcome of the case for a defendant. So the diagram doesn't matter, but the statute does. And the diagrams are very useful for visualizing a particular interpretation or way of fitting a sentence together. And I know this is complicated, so I'm going to start with the simple building blocks, and we're going to come back to this. But this is, this is a diagram of a phrase from 18 U.S.C. 924C, a notoriously confusing section of the federal code. All right, so we're going to start with some simple examples, and I am indebted to Professor Elizabeth Frost at the University of Oregon School of Law, who published an article with some great examples and nicely done illustrations in the Oregon State Bar Bulletin in 2015, and she has given me permission to use her examples and illustrations in this presentation that I'm doing. So let's start with something very simple. The simplest sentence that we could have probably in English would be 2 words, a subject and a verb. You actually don't need any extra words for something like lawyers write or cars drive, right? Or losers weep or something like that. And so we can start simple with your verb and your noun, and we're going to draw a horizontal line and a vertical line that crosses it. The subject of the sentence always goes on the far left. Always, always, always. There's an agreed upon convention for Reed-Kellogg diagrams And that's part of what makes them useful, is that different people can look at the diagram and understand, could read a diagram of a sentence and know what the sentence said, and vice versa. The verb goes on the right of that main line. So the noun on the left and the verb on the right with a vertical line between them. Well, most of our sentences as lawyers are more complicated than that, right? So we usually have a direct object or an indirect object, or what's here called a subject complement. When I was a kid, I was taught to call them predicate nominatives, that are the recipient of the verb, and so of the action of the verb. So lawyers write briefs. We could have a sentence like lawyers argue cases. So the write or argue would be the verb, lawyers is the subject, that's a noun of the sentence, and then we have this other noun that's not the subject of the sentence, it's the target of the verb, that's the direct object. And notice what we do. We separate that by a line, we put it to the far right, and then there's sort of a half line that's a vertical that comes up from the main sentence line. Note that they all stay on the same level in a straight line. Now, sometimes we have things that are not really a separate entity from the subject of the sentence itself, and instead we're trying to say that lawyers are something, like lawyers are writers, or you could say lawyers are advocates, right? And lawyers are professionals. That is a logical sentence in English. Well, when we use the verb to be or are or was or will be, that's a linking verb, that we usually, what we would call a linking verb. And the noun that follows that is really is being equated to the subject of the sentence, even though they're distinct concepts. And so we represent that typically with a slanted line. Sometimes we have indirect objects, of course, like I gave Sam a present, right? Where we have two nouns. We have Sam, who receives it, and then the present, and we might use a diagonal line for that as well. Well, let's move on. What about prepositional phrases? These are what really make our statutes confusing a lot of times, I think, as we have these prepositional phrases and we throw them all in, sometimes a whole bunch of them in a series. Also, something that's very confusing about statutes is the prepositional phrases don't always fall in the statute where we might express them if we were talking, like they're not always in the order that they should be. So here's a very simple prepositional phrase: to clients. So prepositional phrases we put below the main sentence line with a diagonal line connecting the object with the phrase, and specifically, it really matters where you put it, the word that it modifies. And so if we have a sentence like lawyers provide services to clients, then, well, to clients doesn't modify the services, even though I understand that that you could argue in theory, what kind of services do they provide? Well, the services to clients, but really grammatically, the phrase to clients modifies the verb provide, right? So it's a part of the action. And so the preposition itself, and remember, prepositions are little words usually that are either directional or show causation or location, right? So to, from, in, on, under, at, words like that are prepositions. And that word, it goes on the slanted or diagonal line, and then the object of the preposition, which is typically a noun, is going to go on the second line that goes parallel underneath the main sentence line. Okay, what about adjectives and adverbs? These words that we put in our sentences to modify and be more specific and so forth. So here's a sample sentence from Professor Frost. Ethical lawyers competently provide legal services to clients. Well, what's the subject of the sentence? Then plural noun lawyers. What kind of lawyers? Ethical. So ethical is an adjective, and we put adjectives on diagonal lines underneath the noun they modify. And at this point, I hope you can start to see the value of this in analyzing, really parsing a sentence, that we're going to show which word modifies which other word, exactly where it goes in the sentence, and the location matters. Where that slanted line comes down, it comes down underneath the word it actually modifies. Provide, we actually have two things in the sentence that are modifying the verb provide. Competently, right? So that's how they're doing it. And then to clients is also kind of part of how we provide services. We don't just do something in the abstract. We don't provide services to ourselves or provide services in theory, just we provide them to someone else. And so we put that there. By the way, it does not matter how long you make your slanted line. This is just for purposes of aesthetics that it's longer there. Because so that we can fit it along with competently. And then what kind of services do lawyers provide? Well, legal services. So that's an adjective. And notice it wouldn't make any sense if we had legal coming off of lawyers. We're not talking about legal lawyers, we're talking about legal services. So on slanted drop-down lines, directly under the word that's modified, we put our adjectives and our adverbs. And if you have multiple words, two or more words or phrases that modify the noun or verb in the main sentence, they appear together in the word, under the word they modify, and normally in the order that they've occurred in the sentence. Now, let's make it even more complicated. We have these compound sentences that have an independent and a dependent clause. And the example here is, I quit my job because I wanted more money. So we're going to start by taking the independent clause and diagramming it as a simple sentence. I quit my job. That could have been a standalone sentence, whereas just because I wanted more money is not a standalone sentence. It's a dependent clause. So what we do is we diagram both clauses as basically as a sentence, but we take the dependent clause and put it underneath, down a tier and indented, and we connect it with a dotted diagonal line that's our connection word between the clauses. And here, because is a causal connective word. And also notice my is a type of adjective pronoun that we put under job, and more is modifying money in this sentence. Okay, so what happens when you have multiple subjects or multiple verbs or multiple objects in the sentence? This is how we diagram that. So here's our sample sentence, very simple. Mindy and BJ are friends, or we could say Professor Stevenson and his students were in class, right? So we have multiple nouns and then they're doing the verb together. So split compound subjects or objects like this on parallel lines, and then notice the vertical placement of the conjunction on, which is and in this case, on a dotted line, and then the verb, and then we have a predicate nominative or a noun type verb, a verbal type noun for friends. Who are they? That goes after the linking verb. They are friends. But what if they are both friends and comedy writers? Mindy and BJ are friends and comedy writers. So we can do this with the nouns that come after the verb as well, as shown here. So we have our two subjects of the sentence, and then we have two things that they both are. And so we have our linking verb in the middle, and then the two nouns that follow it, also on parallel lines, joined by that conjunction. Now, at this point, I want to highlight an ambiguity that we could introduce into this sentence. Suppose we had one more word and we said Mindy and BJ are friends and terrible comedy writers, So then the reasonable minds could differ about whether that sentence means that BJ and Mindy are friends and they write terrible comedies, or that they're friends and they are terrible at writing comedies, right? And so now maybe you're saying there's no difference between those two. but it could matter. And that's where you use a diagram to highlight if you have a word like terrible in the sentence I just said that could go in a couple different places, you have just isolated a point of potential dispute in statutory, if it was a statute, in statutory interpretation. One of the very common problems we have in statutory interpretation with where to assign words is when those cases about the last antecedent rule, where we have a clause usually near the end of the sentence that's something like in interstate commerce. Very, very common in the federal code. We have a statute that says in or affecting interstate commerce at the end of a very complicated sentence. And the question is, how much of the foregoing words does in interstate commerce modify? Does it modify every verb in the sentence, or the noun that's the final direct object that immediately precedes it, or what? And the last antecedent rule is one solution to that, but the courts don't always follow that. But if you were diagramming it, it would make it very clear that what we're arguing about is where we take a prepositional phrase like in interstate commerce and what word it's going to come under, or words in a sentence. Okay, so let's go back to the Justice Gorsuch example from United States v. Rents. And at the time he was judge, not justice. And here's our statute from 18 U.S.C. 924C. Any person who, during and in relation to any crime of violence or drug trafficking crime, and I'm skipping some unnecessary words that weren't relevant for the case, uses or carries a firearm, or who, in furtherance of any such crime, possesses a firearm, shall, in addition to the punishment provided for such crime, be sentenced to more crime. This is a sentencing enhancement statute that basically ratchets up the penalty if you commit some other crime, independent crime, with a gun. Right. So if you use or carry a gun, and you've probably encountered some of the famous Supreme Court cases about what counts as using a gun or carrying a gun. If the gun is in the glove compartment, locked in the glove compartment in your car, and you don't even get it out when you go to the drug deal, have you carried it to the drug deal? If you are showing someone that you have a gun, but you keep it in its holster, and you never take it out or brandish it or anything like that, have you used the gun? And the Supreme Court has wrestled with these questions. And here, the problem was what the commission of a crime means. And again, so here's what Justice Gorsuch does. Now, he puts any person together on one line. Technically, my English teacher would have said any should be on a slanted line underneath person. It's a word that's modifying person. And then you can see the verb shall be sentenced. That's fine. That's the verb of the sentence. And then to, that's our prepositional phrase, a term of imprisonment. And if we were going to cut out the dependent clause, which is sandwiched in the middle of all of that, the simple like now subject and then verb of this sentence is any person shall be sentenced to a term of imprisonment. That's what this sentence is about. But, well, what person? And then we have this dependent clause, who uses a firearm. And so notice we write that out almost as another sentence, a very simple sentence here. Who is a pronoun. We've connected it with a straight dotted line. You haven't seen that before yet, but that's how you would do this, how we're connecting this, or at least how Judge Gorsuch did. Uses is the verb, and firearm is the direct object. And of course, again, an English teacher would take a point off because he should have put a on a diagonal line coming underneath firearm. That wasn't the issue in the case, was whether we had one or more firearms. The question was the crime of violence or drug trafficking crime, and during and in relation to. And so notice here we have a compound preposition that we could have done with that kind of branching device if we wanted to be very precise. I think he was sort of doing a simplified or modification of the standard Reed-Kellogg diagram. But this is what the case turned on, was how many crimes were committed here during the use of a gun. And specifically, Rents used a gun only once, but he did so during and in relation to two separate crimes of violence, one could argue. So he fired a single shot from his rifle, and it passed through one victim, and then hit a second person who was standing behind that person and killed the second person. And so we have two victims. Is that two crimes? And in that case, can we apply the sentencing enhancement statute of 924C twice, or does it only apply once? And so Judge Gorsuch phrases this when he wrote the majority opinion in the case. Does the statute permit the government to charge one violation or two? And he ended up arguing here that basically the majority held that the government could charge a defendant with two crimes, one crime of violence for each victim, even though it was only it was only one shot from the rifle, one round that was discharged. But for purposes of 924C, he says that this phrase, during any crime of violence, applies to uses, not crimes, right? And so Gorsuch uses the diagram to show that this part of the sentence, during and in relation to any crime of violence or drug trafficking crime, is all just a modification phrase describing a verb. And therefore, the government would have to prove multiple uses, which they hadn't done. There was only one use of a firearm in order to apply 924C multiple times. This really mattered because each time a court sentences you applies 924, if it's a separate crime, these are going to be concurrent sentences, and it's a hefty enhancement. And so for Mr. Rents, this was the difference between a 5-year sentence and 25 to life. So the distinction really did matter, and that's why it goes up on appeal to the 10th Circuit. Reasonable minds could differ about how to interpret this very confusing statute. And so we have dissenting and concurring opinions in the case that go through things like other parts of the toolbox of statutory interpretation, like legislative history and the policy arguments, and maybe other canons of construction. For just Judge Gorsuch, for the majority, they diagrammed it and they said all of this is coming off of one verb, and we only have one use that was shown in this case, even though we can apply that single verb to multiple crimes. So a single action can count as multiple crimes if you produce multiple victims. So if you do an explosion, right, you set off a bomb and it kills 20 people, we can charge you with 20 counts of murder, even though it was a single explosive device. That's fine. But what they're saying is, for purposes of applying 924C, which is a firearm, using a firearm enhancement statute, then we really do need separate uses of the firearm. Okay, one more example. This is also pretty complicated, and this is from a 2016 case from the Courts of Appeals in California, and the case is a nonprofit called Stand Up for California versus the state of California. And this was a litigation over casinos and the state authorizing or approving casinos. And I have for you a quote from the opinion. Proposition 1A provides that the governor is authorized to negotiate and conclude compacts subject to ratification by the legislature for the operation of slot machines and for the conduct of lottery games and banking and percentage card games by federally recognized Indian tribes and Indian lands in California in accordance with federal law. And so because the whole case is going to turn on this very confusing statute, which is a string of prepositional clauses, the judge writing the majority opinion uses a diagram to show what the different prepositional clauses are modifying. And you'll notice, so we have governor, that's the subject of the sentence, the modifies governor, the verb is negotiate, and the direct object is compacts. And then this whole phrase of for the operation really modifies what kind of compacts. And operation, I don't want to get too far off of track in English grammar, is something we might call a verbal noun or a gerund. It's a noun that describes an action. So it's not a verb, but it is an action noun. And now notice we have these multiple prepositional phrases. In fact, and the court is saying that all of these modify operation except for this one in California, which modifies lands. And this really matters, right? Are the compacts in accordance with federal law, or is the operation of the casinos in accordance with federal law? Think about that's a very different concept. Is a governor authorizing an agreement, a compact, and the compact has to accord with federal law, or is he authorized to make a compact for someone to do something, but that person has to do it in accordance with federal law, and so forth? And again, of slot machines and other things by federally recognized Indian tribes on Indian lands in California. And so again, this is a beautiful, complex example of a sentence diagram, but the case turns on where we're assigning these different phrases. And so the diagram is very useful for that. It's not only useful for the court to visualize, show graphically what they're doing, but it could be useful for you as an attorney just to do privately in sort of your, on a legal pad in your own brainstorming session, to unpack a statute that relates to your case and really get a clear sense of what is in dispute. And if the point of dispute is what does this prepositional phrase modify, you can kind of draw that out with a sentence diagram. Now, for those of you who are really loving this, which is probably not many, I do want to show you can just keep going with this. And there are websites that and YouTube videos and so forth that will walk you through sort of advanced sentence diagrams. There's websites that will start with simple ones and then show you how to diagram more obscure parts of speech. And there's even a site that diagrams the opening sentences of like 50 or 100 famous novels and so forth. I like this one because it's an example of very complicated sentence, right? The responsibilities of a beekeeper are, which are too numerous to list, are sometimes difficult, tedious, daunting, but the rewards of raising bees can be great. And notice that's a dependent clause that gets its own little diagram on the second tier indented. And then there's another clause that's dependent on that one if you respect these industrious and important little insects, right? So the responsibilities of a beekeeper, which are too numerous to list, are sometimes difficult, tiring, exhausting, but the rewards of raising bees can be great if you respect these industrious, important little insects. And so again, you could take a very complex sentence in a statute, and any sentence can be diagrammed, and it can help you really map out what is going on with each word and each clause in the sentence. And that concludes our video about sentence diagramming and statutory interpretation.